Everyone, how's it going? Happy Saturday. Hope everyone's having a good holiday season. Today, we'll be talking pretty practically about how to get an LLM project kind of off the ground from an idea to deployed and running in production. Over the past year and a half, we've worked with a lot of teams who have gone through this for the first time. We've built our own AI-based features, and so wanted to put together just a quick guide that should be super practical and helpful as you maybe scope out a project or think about your next AI project. So we'll run through a couple of basic steps, and we will come back to our prompt generator, which is a recent AI feature that we launched as an example throughout to kind of give you something very practical. And so a couple of major steps along the way that we'll cover. So defining success, test cases, evals, how to pick a model, the prompt engineering process, and then deployment and monitoring. And so let me move myself down a little bit. So success criteria, we think this is a really important step just to kind of take some bit of time up front and try to think of what success looks like. This will help you not only for the later on prompt engineering and evaluation process, but it will help you when you're kind of thinking about the feature itself. You really want to think about, okay, what does success look like here in terms of if we were to ship this, and like how would it help our users and how would we measure that? So you want it to be specific. You want this criteria to be something that you can actually measure. You want it to be relevant and time bound as well. And so, whoops. There we go. We're back. And so it's just like a very quick step. You don't have to spend a lot of time here, but it's important to do up front. So a bad example for our prompt generator would be something like increase user engagement. It's vague, it's not measurable, but saying something like, increase the number of prompts that are created as a proportion with the generator by, 20% or something along those lines would be something better, very measurable, or this example here as well. And if you think about, okay, what does this look like for my, project? Here are a couple of the common ones, and we have the whole guide on this below, which will be linked below. But task fidelity, consistency, latency, accuracy, like user interaction. So with our case, like how many prompts are actually being generated out of all prompts that are being created. Next up is test cases, and this I think is a really fun part of the process and making it much more of a like test-driven development. So test cases is essentially data you want to test your prompts against. So, your users will put random things into, whatever prompt that you're allowing them to inject data into through your application. And so it's good to have a set of test cases to run through both before you launch the feature and then continually. So the classic ones to test against would be happy path. So this is kind of common or expected inputs from the users. So for us, it could be like, I need a prompt that generates blog posts based on content, or I need a prompt that classifies sentiment based on X, Y, or Z. So that'd be like typical. The more important ones to test against and the like ones that are more forgotten about are like the edge cases. So ambiguous inputs, things that are unclear, perhaps. So contradictory inputs, things that go against each other, and then like irrelevant or incomplete. Like what if a user we're expecting them to put a task description for us to generate a prompt from that, and they just input blank or hi. How should we handle that? And so we have a tool to help you generate some test cases that you can use. That'll be in the blog post. That will be there in the first link below. And there's a open source template that is behind that tool that's deployed via a prompt hub form. And so another way that you can continually develop your test cases is look at what users are actually putting into your application and add those back. So if you see situations where the user puts in some weird stuff or ambiguous things, like adding those to your test cases is a very good opportunity to then go increase the robustness of your prompt and expand it over time. And so here's a couple of examples. So happy path, generate a blog post outline about LLMs, kind of a structured outputs type of test case, what we called it. And then ambiguous edge cases with minimal input. So here are a couple of examples. And, we started with 5 when I was just doing like my first iteration of prompt engineering. And you can, import these in Prompt Hub. You can add them one by one and create these. You can name them, organize them, so on and so forth. And this will allow you to just, once you create it once, run it against all your prompts. Next up is evals. So my general opinion on evals is they're extremely task specific, and there are some situations where I think the eye test and like just manually going through is like a good way to kind of start. You need to do a lot of them and you need to do it at scale, but that can be like a very quick way to get something up and running. So for the prompt generator, I basically just did a ton of testing, added a ton of test cases, and then continually to add it to the amount of test cases I had when we had things ship it in production. Just because it's hard to set up like a rigorous and extensive eval for something like that. In some cases, very easy, if you're doing classification, something like that. Some cases, it's going to be not so easy. So I wouldn't spend too much time here if it's challenging. And I think relying on subject matter experts and the eye test is like an okay place to start. But in terms of like what makes up an eval, I guess we should take a step back. So there's the prompt, the output, the like expected answer or the golden answer, and then some score that is like the delta between the output and the golden answer. And there are a couple of types. So you can do code-based grading. So if you just need to do like use regular expressions to see if it classified the sentiment as positive or negative, or that it contains certain information. There's human grading, which is kind of like eye test. Maybe you can add some scores to it if you want. And then LLM-based grading, where you use an LLM to evaluate the outputs. LLM-based grading sounds very good in theory, but I think it removes the human from the loop too much sometimes. And additionally, you're really like putting a lot of trust on the prompt that you're writing for the LLM-based grader. And if it's just like not good, then like you can't expect the grader to, or if it's not aligned or written clearly, or the instructions are ambiguous in any way, then the outputs will be kind of worthless or maybe misleading. An example of that is people will often say, hey, like rate this on a scale of 1 to 5, with this output in terms of X, Y, or Z. But if the LLM doesn't know what a 5 or a 1 kind of represents, it's going to have a really hard time. And that might be very different from what you would say in your head is a 1 or a 5. Moving on. So the question of like what model to pick, it's very, task specific and team specific, and we'll give you like a little bit of a framework. I like to think of doing an initial narrowing down of like an initial model selection. So for us with the prompt generator, I knew I was just going to test the latest and greatest of the 3 major providers, being OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google at the time. Is that those were we wanted to create prompts that were tailored to those providers, so we wanted to use each one of those providers for the prompts. So there's actually 3 prompt generator prompts that run that are different based on whichever model you're using. So, but we knew we were going to do the best one and the fastest one. So that narrowed that down pretty easily for us. But in terms of like a little bit more of a framework that we ran through, these are like, I think, some good questions to ask yourself. So what's the primary task? What are your constraints? Is it cost, latency, hosting, scalability, things along those lines? Do you have to host on something like secure, like AWS Bedrock or Azure for security reasons? It's all very dependent on what you're doing. Latency, so like what's the UX of the thing that you're working on, things along those lines. For us, we didn't really care about cost. Latency was important. Hosting, it didn't really matter. We were just going to hit the APIs directly. And, we just wanted to be able to kind of tap into the providers that we needed to. So really like latency and performance were the 2 big ones for us. And at the time, I guess these are like kind of quasi updated, but like I said, essentially we did best and fastest model from each of the major providers, and we just did a bunch of testing there. And so now we can move over to the kind of fun part, which is the prompt engineering. And in terms of like a good workflow, what we do now, and like what I do, is I start with the prompt generator to get me an initial version. Very rarely do I start like writing a version from scratch. Then I do a bunch of model testing. So whenever you're doing prompt engineering, you want to keep everything the same except for one of the variables, the models being one of them. So initially starting by testing a bunch of models. Once you've kind of nailed that down, you can keep that consistent. Move to testing across different data. Presumably you've been testing with just like one piece of data, which is good. And now you want to test across a bunch of different use cases. And that will reveal things that probably need to change or be updated. So then you just kind of continue that process of testing with various pieces of data, make sure it handles edge cases, iterate on the prompt. And then, at the end, I would say, and this can kind of happen anywhere, depending on like how you do your prompt engineering, but refining the prompts to make sure that you are setting yourself up for prompt caching is like a huge, easy win. And something we see that doesn't happen enough for teams. We'll touch on that in a little bit. But yeah, prompt generator and prompt hub free for all users, and I think a really good starting point. It's based on best practices, based on whatever model you're using. Test across the models. Again, you can do this in prompt hub very easily through batch testing. Any plane has access to this. Data sets, again, we covered that. Again, any plane can access that. And then, so some typical prompt engineering errors you're going to run into. So output structure not being like the correct shape. And, solutions there to kind of think on is, be explicit about the formatting requirements, use the structured outputs when you can. And then if that's not helping, providing examples via few shot prompting could be quite helpful in terms of showing the model versus telling the model what to do. Hallucinations, kind of an intractable problem, but I think what we've seen is you can be direct against whatever hallucinations you're seeing. So adding some verbiage in the prompt to combat against whatever hallucination you're seeing, adding constraints, adding a self-checking kind of step, or maybe using a prompt chain that has a second prompt that validates the first model's response based on some criteria. Style and tone, a more challenging one to solve. And we have a whole article like all on prompt engineering for content creation, but sometimes a persona can help here. And then again, I think using few shot learning for like show don't tell is a big thing that can help. And then accuracy, it's just maybe not doing the thing it's supposed to do accurate enough. We've seen reasoning, whether it's done via chain of thought or just via these reasoning models, to be very helpful here. Adding multiple prompts in a chain can be helpful in terms of making sure things are correct before sending them back to users. And then giving models an out, I think, is always helpful in terms of letting them say, hey, I don't know the answer, versus giving an incorrect one. Bunch of methods to try here that I think would be helpful. All the guides will be linked below, so we won't spend too much time on them. And we mentioned this before, just in terms of prompt caching, the 60-second version of this is you want to have the static content of whatever you're sending the request to be at the top. And then that would allow you to hit the cache and have a cache hit. And so like if you have a long system message, like obviously have that in the beginning and have the instructions, and then have like the user input after that. So you want to have everything static at the top. This will optimize your chance for a cache hit. And we have a whole article on that. And then let's say you have a prompt that's working well. I'd say don't copy the prompt directly into code. You want to like decouple the prompt engineering and software engineering so that you can enable non-technical team members or subject matter experts to like quickly update the prompt via a system like Prompt Hub without requiring a new deploy. You can change the model without requiring a new deploy. And prompt engineering and software engineering, they just move on different timescales, where you might be doing a lot of prompt engineering work one day, and then you might not deploy new code for a while after that. And so having a system where you can pull prompts from, I think is very, very, very important, and will make it easy to move much faster. And we've got a bunch of tooling for this in terms of our kind of Git style versioning. There's branches. There's a lot of different ways to pull for prompts from Prompt Hub. And then once it's live, having some kind of monitoring, I think, is nice. And we have something set up here. You can use other tools as well. I think the best thing to do is to really talk to users about it. So reach out to folks who have been using it, see how they're liking it, and seeing the retention on that specific feature and other just like general product related kind of best practices. And I know we're a little bit long today. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, add them in the comments below. We'll list a bunch of resources below as well. See you guys.